After Germany's defeat in World War I, people did not feel that they had only lost a war. They felt that the whole world had turned against them. The empire fell, the Kaiser stepped down, and the old system suddenly disappeared. A new state appeared with a democratic system called the Weimar Republic, but most people did not trust it from the beginning. On top of all that came the peace agreement called the Treaty of Versailles, which placed full responsibility for the war on Germany, imposed huge financial reparations on it, and deprived it of lands and colonies it considered part of its strength. As the years passed, this feeling of defeat turned into a feeling of humiliation. Many Germans would say to themselves, "We do not deserve this humiliation. We are a strong people. How did we end up here?" At the same time, the economy began to collapse. Prices rose insanely, and the currency lost its value day after day. People went out to the markets carrying bags and sometimes wheelbarrows full of banknotes just to buy simple food for a single day. The salaries of entire months turned into nothing within a few days. Saving became meaningless, and economic security disappeared. In this chaos, the streets filled with clashes between extremist groups from the left and the right, and the police were in between, while each side claimed it was the only one capable of saving the country. Many people did not understand the details of politics, but they felt one clear thing: their lives were getting worse, and no one in power seemed to know what they were doing. Here the question appears on which the whole video is built. How can a tired, angry, fearful society open the door to one person and believe that he is the savior who will restore its dignity, only to discover later that it handed him the keys to the greatest nightmare in the history of the 20th century? In Germany after the war, many people began to hate not only the Treaty of Versailles, but the very idea of democracy itself. There was a feeling that politicians talked a lot and achieved nothing. Where is the work? Where is the bread? Where are the jobs? These simple questions are what opened the door to a new discourse, a discourse that promised strength, order, and revenge against everyone who had humiliated Germany. In this atmosphere, society becomes psychologically ready to receive anyone who speaks with confidence, diagnoses the problem in a simple way, and points his finger at a clear enemy. These are the cause. These are the ones who destroyed your lives. Right here begins the story of the rise of Adolf Hitler, from an almost unknown man to a leader, applauded by millions, who then leads them down a path that ends in total destruction, not only for Europe, but for Germany itself before anyone else. This background is important because it reminds us that tyrants do not suddenly descend from the sky. They usually come in a moment of general exhaustion, at a time when people feel that everything has lost its meaning and that the only solution is one strong man who does what is necessary and does not care about laws or about talk of rights. And this is exactly the door through which Hitler entered. Adolf Hitler was not born a tyrant or a leader. He was born into a simple family on the outskirts of the old Austrian Empire. His father, Alois, was an older man who worked as a customs official, strict and quick-tempered, especially when he drank. Sometimes he would beat his son violently, not because the boy had done something exceptional, but because the father himself carried suppressed anger and released it on the weakest person in the house. On the other side was the mother, Clara, a kind woman who tried to protect her child with all her strength. to the point that in some accounts she would stand between him and his father's blows. This contrast between violence and tenderness created within Hitler a strange mixture, fear of power and admiration for it at the same time. He learned early that the one who strikes is the one who imposes his opinion, and that the weak person's voice is not heard. At school, he was not a particularly outstanding student, but there was a history teacher named Leopold Putsch who had a deep impact on him. This teacher was a hardline nationalist who always told history from the perspective of the great German nation oppressed by weak rulers and enemies abroad. These stories planted in the boy's mind a dangerous idea. There is a great people under siege who need someone to liberate them. But up to this point, Hitler was no more than a lost young man. He tried to enter the field of art. He painted and applied to the Academy of Fine Arts, but was not accepted. He lived a poor life, moving between cheap rooms in big cities, dreaming dreams much larger than his reality, and not finding a real place that matched his ambitions. He seemed like one of millions who could dissolve into the crowd and end up a minor employee or unemployed without any impact. Then a decisive year came, the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Suddenly, this lost young man found something that gave his life meaning. He volunteered in the Bavarian army and went to the front. There, in the muddy trenches among shells, bullets, and poison gas, he discovered something important, that he could be part of a cause. He was no longer a wandering individual, but a soldier in an army fighting for the honor of the nation. At the front, he was wounded at least once, exposed to gas, temporarily lost his sight and then regained it, and received the Iron Cross for his bravery. All of this convinced him that he was not an ordinary person, that there was a special mission for him. When the war ended and he learned that Germany had signed the surrender, he felt that something inside him had broken. It was not just the end of a war, but the end of the dream on which he had built his entire sense of meaning. From here begins a new phase, the phase of a man who sees himself as betrayed, who sees that the sacrifices he and millions of soldiers had made were sold at the politicians' table. This feeling of injustice does not go away. It turns into anger, and anger turns into a search for an explanation. His preferred explanation was simple and dangerous at the same time. We did not lose at the front. We were betrayed from within. This idea would later become the cornerstone of his entire rhetoric, because it allowed him to tell people, "You are heroes. You did not make a mistake. The problem is not in you. The problem is in those traitors who ruled, in the minorities who corrupt the country, and in the enemies who live among us." In this way, he turns defeat into fuel and turns his personal wound into a political weapon. After the war ended, life in Germany was no longer just a passing economic difficulty, but a series of successive crises. The Treaty of Versailles forced the state to pay enormous reparations, restricted its army, and forced it to give up lands and colonies. Many Germans felt that their country had turned from a great power into a humiliated state. In cafes and homes, people asked, 4 years of blood and sacrifice. Why? At the same time, the new democracy, the Weimar Republic, was trying to walk through fire from all sides. The extreme left wanted a revolution in the Bolshevik style, and the hardline right wanted to overthrow the system and restore a strong authoritarian rule. Governments changed quickly, and divisions within parliament made making any major decisions extremely difficult. On such fragile ground, any economic earthquake was enough to bring everything down. Then came one of the harshest blows: hyperinflation. Prices rose to imaginary levels, and the old German currency lost almost all its value. Images of people carrying bundles of banknotes to buy bread became a symbol of that period. The middle class, which had spent its life trying to save and build a stable life, suddenly discovered that everything it had saved had become meaningless. This feeling of economic collapse gave any angry rhetoric a special appeal. Here began to take shape what was later called the stab-in-the-back myth. This myth claimed that the German army was not truly defeated on the battlefield, but was betrayed by the politicians who signed the surrender, by revolutionaries in the streets, and by internal enemies who were portrayed as hating Germany from within. In this atmosphere, many people linked this idea with old hatred toward Jews and leftists, turning them from political opponents into traitors in the popular imagination. For Hitler, this myth was a gift from the sky. It gave him a ready-made story to present to people. You are brave. You are victims of a conspiracy. You did not lose. Others sold you out. Through this narrative, he did not need to explain the complexities of World War I or the mistakes of military leaders. It was enough to point to a specific group and say, "These are the cause." During this period, the army still played an important role in politics behind the scenes. Some officers hated the communists and feared a revolution similar to what happened in Russia, so they looked for people capable of influencing soldiers and the public to prevent them from drifting toward the left. Here they found in Hitler a suitable person, an angry man, a talented speaker who believed in extreme nationalism and was ready to attack communists without mercy. Hitler was tasked with monitoring small parties, attending their meetings, and writing reports about them. At one of these meetings, he entered a room filled with a small number of people belonging to a small party called the German Workers' Party. He found himself passionately debating with them, then discovered that their nationalist ideas resembled what was inside him. Little by little, he stops being an observer and becomes a participant. After a short time, he is no longer satisfied with participation. He becomes the most prominent speaker in the party, then its undisputed leader. He changes the name of the party to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, and adds symbols, slogans, and banners to it. He invents a special salute and red flags bearing the swastika. He creates a semi-military militia, the Storm Detachment or SA, which wears brown shirts and fills the streets with marches and clashes with opponents. He issues a party newspaper to spread its messages. All of this makes the party appear much larger than its real size. Here appears Hitler's most dangerous face, his ability to speak in crowded halls. He stands and shouts and becomes angry, gestures with his hand, raises his voice, then lowers it, suddenly stops, and stares at the audience. Many of those present leave the hall feeling that he has expressed their suppressed anger. He presents them with clear enemies: the Treaty of Versailles, traitorous politicians, Jews, communists, democracy itself. And with every speech, the party grows more. But Hitler does not stop at speeches. In the year 1923, he decides to make a leap far greater than his size and tries to repeat what Mussolini did in Italy, namely overthrowing the government by force. This adventure will later be known as the Beer Hall Putsch, and it will end in a disastrous failure, but at the same time it will push him one step closer to fame and power. On a night in Munich, Hitler and his assistants storm a crowded beer hall where senior officials in the Bavarian state are giving a speech in front of a large audience. Hitler enters with armed men, fires a shot into the air, and announces that the government has fallen and that the national revolution has begun. He tries to force the officials to support his movement and plans a march to Berlin, similar to the March on Rome carried out by Italian fascism. But what happens after that is far from his dreams. The army and the police do not join him but confront him. The march ends with gunfire in the street. Members of the party are killed, and Hitler is arrested a few days later. The country's newspapers speak of a reckless adventurer who tried to overthrow the state by force and failed. Apparently, his political career seems to end here. However, his trial quickly turns into a propaganda platform. Instead of apologizing or justifying himself, Hitler uses the court to deliver long speeches in which he attacks the Treaty of Versailles, the Weimar Republic, the communists, the Jews, and everyone he sees as having betrayed Germany. Newspapers report his words, and even the state apparatus gives him a space he never dreamed of. He is sentenced to prison, but the term is relatively short and the prison conditions are comfortable compared to what people imagine prisons to be. In his imprisonment in Landsberg Castle, he begins dictating a book to his close followers. This book will be known as Mein Kampf, a long book full of repetition, but it clearly reveals his worldview. A world divided into races where the Aryan race is at the top and Jews are at the bottom of the ladder, as a corrupting force that must be eliminated. In this book, he writes his hostility toward democracy and his belief in a totalitarian state led by a single absolute leader. He writes about the necessity of expansion into the East to obtain living space for the German nation. Many people read the book later and do not take it seriously, but in reality, it was a roadmap to catastrophe. After his release from prison in 1925, Hitler learns an important lesson. Sudden coups are not the way to power. The new path will be slower but safer. Elections, alliances, and exploiting the law against the law itself. He re-establishes the Nazi Party, focuses on building its organization, expands the ranks of the SA, and later the SS, which will become the most famous instrument of terror in the regime. In the early years after his release, the German economy returned somewhat to stability thanks to international agreements and loans. During this period, the Nazis do not receive many votes and remain on the margins of political life. But the major crisis has not yet come. When the Great Depression strikes the world in 1929, banks collapse and unemployment doubles, Hitler discovers that the time he has been waiting for has arrived. With Germany entering the crisis of the Great Depression after the collapse of the New York Stock Exchange in the late 20s, the economic nightmare returns in full force. Factories close, millions become unemployed. Families struggle to provide the simplest daily needs. The general feeling was that the Weimar Republic had tried everything and failed. Here exactly the Nazi Party found the space it had been waiting for years. Hitler and his party did not present a complex, detailed economic program. Instead, they offered simple slogans that everyone could understand. We will restore jobs. We will abolish the Treaty of Versailles. We will unite the people, and we will stop chaos and communism. In times of fear, simple promises appear very attractive, even if there is no clear plan behind them. The propaganda rallies, trips across villages, large banners, newspaper articles, and Hitler's voice on the radio All of this created the impression that the Nazi Party was the party of order and strength in the face of a collapsing world. Young people were searching for meaning, the elderly for security, and the middle class for someone to save what remained of their lives, and the party told everyone, "We are the solution." In parliamentary elections, the Nazis began to rise dramatically. At first, they received a modest number of seats. Then suddenly they jumped to second place, then became the largest party in parliament. Although they did not hold an absolute majority, their presence became a reality that could not be ignored. Here, a new problem appeared. No stable government could be formed without them. Some conservative politicians at the time saw Hitler as a tool that could be used. They despised democracy, hated communism, and feared popular chaos, so they thought they could place Hitler in the position of chancellor and surround him with reasonable men and control him from behind. This idea would prove to be one of the most dangerous political mistakes of the entire 20th century. At the beginning of the 1930s, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. On paper, he was the head of government in a democratic system, but in his mind, he was something else entirely. This was the golden opportunity to transform the system from within. Just a few weeks later, a large fire broke out in the Reichstag building. A young communist was arrested, and the government used the incident to portray it as a massive conspiracy to overthrow the state. In this atmosphere of fear, Hitler pushed for the issuance of an emergency decree that suspended many basic rights: freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression. Many people told themselves, "It's okay, this is temporary to protect the country." But this step was an open door to a new era of repression. Shortly after that, the so-called Enabling Act was passed, which granted the government the power to issue laws without returning to Parliament. Practically, Parliament became toothless without real power. In appearance, there were still seats, sessions, and voting, but the final decision was in the hands of a small group led by one man, Adolf Hitler. In the months and years that followed, the Nazi regime moved quickly to crush any possible resistance. Other parties were dissolved or forced to withdraw. Many of their leaders were arrested, exiled, or politically destroyed. Trade unions were abolished and replaced with organizations affiliated with the regime. Independent journalism was silenced, and a single opinion was repeated morning and evening through newspapers, radio, and posters. At the same time, the apparatus of terror begins to be built. The Gestapo, the secret police that works with confidential files and informants in every neighborhood and in almost every building. People do not know who might report them: neighbors, work colleagues, even a family member. When a society reaches this level of suspicion, silence becomes the safest option. Hitler does not limit himself to controlling civilian institutions. Within his own party, there is another force that worries him: the Storm Detachment, or SA, led by Ernst Röhm. This Schutzbefehl military militia had helped him greatly during the rise phase, but now it worries the German army and Hitler himself. Its leaders speak about a second revolution and deeper change in society, and this disturbs the military and economic elite whose support Hitler wants to maintain. The solution chosen by Hitler is the pure Nazi solution, eliminating everyone at once. On a night known as the Night of the Long Knives, leaders of the SA and other opponents are arrested and assassinated in a bloody internal purge, after which the influence of this militia largely ends and the SS rises as an elite force personally loyal to Hitler. Shortly after, President Hindenburg dies, and Hitler seizes the opportunity, combining the positions of president and chancellor and declaring himself the Führer, the supreme leader of the nation, state, and army. Officers and soldiers take an oath of loyalty, not to the Constitution, but to him personally. From this moment, Germany can be said to have officially become a totalitarian state under the rule of a single individual. But political repression was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The regime did not want only to govern, but carried within it a deep racist ideology that saw internal enemies who must be isolated, then excluded, and eventually completely eliminated. Here begins the next phase of the story, the manufacturing of the enemy again through laws named after cities, like Nuremberg, through relentless propaganda tools, and through steps that seemed small at first, but whose end was among the darkest in history. After Hitler consolidated power, he turned to an old goal in his thinking, reshaping German society from within according to his racist vision. It was not enough for him to rule. He wanted to decide who belongs to the national community and who is considered foreign or contaminated. Here, Jews and other targeted groups enter the heart of the storm. From the very first moments, the regime used gradual tools. At the beginning, boycott campaigns against Jewish-owned shops, slogans on walls, warnings against dealing with them, and gradual exclusion from government and academic jobs. On the surface, this was presented as social organization, but the deeper message was clear. These people are not part of you. Then came a more explicit and dangerous step, the Nuremberg laws in the mid-1930s. These laws were not just minor legal amendments. They were effectively a declaration that Jews were no longer full citizens. Jews were defined not only by religion but by origin and family, meaning on a racial basis. Marriage or relationships between Jews and Aryans became legally forbidden, and restrictions were placed on everything connecting Jews to public life. Over time, Jews were expelled from professions one after another: medicine, law, education, media, arts. Many tried to emigrate, but the world was not always ready to receive them. Others stayed hoping things would not go further and that this was only a harsh wave that would pass. In the background, the propaganda machine worked non-stop. Magazines and newspapers such as Der Stürmer, films, speeches, and posters portraying Jews as an internal danger and the cause of previous crises, from the defeat in the war to economic collapse. In schools, children learned these ideas as scientific facts. In this way, hatred transforms from an opinion into an accepted truth in the minds of many. Then, on a dark November night, hatred exploded into open violence. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. On this night, dozens of synagogues were burned, shop windows were smashed, homes were attacked, and thousands of men were arrested. Streets in many German cities were filled with shards of glass, as if reflecting the shattered safety Jews once lived in. The outside world saw what happened and condemned it, but did not go beyond diplomatic protests. Inside Germany, many people did not directly participate in the violence, but they also did not stand against it. Some were afraid, some agreed, and some preferred to look away. Here, precisely, a totalitarian state becomes strong when it plants fear and hatred together and places people between two difficult choices: silence or participation. For Hitler and the Nazi regime, this stage was another step on the path, not the end. Their goal was not merely to humiliate Jews or isolate them economically. It was far greater. But to implement such a brutal project, they needed certain conditions. A war that justifies violence, chaos that covers what is happening, and armies moving across vast territories away from the eyes of the world. These conditions would come with the end of the 1930s and the beginning of the 1940s, when Hitler decided that the time for imperial expansion had come and that Germany needed living space in the East, even at the cost of millions of lives. After securing control over the internal front, Hitler began moving toward his external goal, tearing apart the Treaty of Versailles and expanding in Europe. At first, his steps were calculated but bold, rearming the army, beginning to build an air force that was actually prohibited under the treaty, and increasing the number of soldiers beyond permitted limits. These moves were almost open, but European countries limited themselves to verbal protests without real intervention. His next step was sending German troops into the Rhineland, a region that was supposed to remain demilitarized. It was a gamble. If France had responded militarily at that moment, Hitler would have been forced to retreat and his internal prestige might have been shaken. But nothing happened. The French army did not move, and the Allies limited themselves to condemnation. For Hitler, this was a clear signal. I can try more, and no one will stop me. Then came a larger step, the annexation of Austria, known as the Anschluss. Many Germans in Austria saw themselves as part of the greater German nation, so some welcomed the German army with flowers and cheers. Hitler appeared in the streets of Vienna as a victor, and the general feeling inside Germany was that he was achieving what previous governments had failed to do, unifying the German people under one flag. After Austria, attention turned to Czechoslovakia, specifically the Sudetenland, where a large number of Germans lived. He exploited this minority as a pretext to demand the region and then more. At the famous Munich conference, leaders of Britain and France accepted Hitler's demands in an attempt to avoid war, in what became known as the policy of appeasement. The British Prime Minister returned home waving the agreement and announcing that he had brought peace for our time. But in reality, he had only given Hitler more time. A few months later, Hitler occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, proving that his promises in Munich were only a step along the way. Now he no longer spoke only about unifying Germans, but about redrawing the map of Europe. The next target was Poland, and this time Britain and France finally understood that the real red line had been reached. At the beginning of September 1939, the German army launched a massive attack on Poland using blitzkrieg tactics, a mixture of tanks, aircraft, and rapid movement to break enemy defenses before they could recover. Within a few weeks, Polish resistance collapsed, and Germany and the Soviet Union divided parts of the country under a secret agreement. The invasion of Poland was the moment after which postponing confrontation was no longer possible. Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II officially began, and with it, Hitler's project entered a completely new phase. The rapid early victories in Poland and later in Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France gave the impression that he was invincible. But what happened in those early years of blitz victories concealed beneath its surface preparation for one of the darkest chapters of the century, using the cover of war to implement an industrial-scale project of extermination. With the stunning beginning of the Blitzkrieg in the West, many inside Germany believed that Hitler was a military genius and that his ability to challenge and defeat the Allies confirmed he was the savior they had been promised. But his ambition did not stop at Poland or France. For years he had spoken in his book and speeches about the necessity of expanding eastward into the territories of the Soviet Union to obtain living space for the German nation. In his view, these regions were a vast reservoir of land and resources inhabited by peoples he considered lower in the racial hierarchy. In the summer of 1941, Hitler began implementing this terrifying dream, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. In the first weeks, German armies achieved enormous advances and encircled large numbers of Soviet forces, capturing hundreds of thousands of soldiers. But this rapid success carried within it the seeds of catastrophe. The Eastern Front was extremely vast, the winter was harsh, the enemy was stubborn, and German resources were not unlimited in this brutal war. In the East, a darker stage began in the Nazi regime's policy toward the Jews and other targeted groups. Special units called the Mobile Killing Squads, the Einsatzgruppen, accompanied the army in the occupied territories and carried out widespread massacres against civilians, especially Jews, away from the eyes of most ordinary Germans themselves. These massacres represented a transitional stage between legal persecution and an organized project of extermination. Over time, the regime decided to move to what it officially called the final solution to the Jewish question, a term that concealed a decision to exterminate millions of human beings. A network of camps was created, some for forced labor and others built specifically for death, where people were transported in overcrowded trains, then separated, stripped of their belongings, and large numbers of them were sent to organized killing chambers in an industrial process managed as if it were a production line. These crimes were mostly carried out in occupied territories in the East, far from the daily life of the ordinary citizen in Berlin or Munich. Some news leaked out. Some soldiers spoke about what they had seen. Some refugees transmitted testimonies, but many preferred not to go deeper into these stories. The war itself, the bombing and food shortages, filled life with anxiety to the point that many people told themselves, "We already have enough problems." At the same time, the military balance began to tilt against Hitler. The attack on Moscow stalled in the face of winter, and the fierce fighting, the Battle of Stalingrad, turned into a major turning point. An entire army was almost encircled and then surrendered in a massive moral and military blow to Germany. From here, the war project shifted from a series of victories into a series of desperate attempts to slow down collapse. However, Hitler showed no intention of retreating. On the contrary, he became more rigid, rejecting every realistic advice and accusing his commanders of incompetence or betrayal. Whenever bad news came from the fronts, while soldiers were dying in harsh, icy conditions on the Eastern Front, the machinery of extermination was still operating in the background as if it were detached from any military defeats. Even in moments of retreat, the regime did not stop implementing its darkest idea. With the arrival of 1945, it became clear that the Third Reich was approaching its end. From the east, the armies of the Soviet Union were advancing, crossing the Oder River and closing step by step towards the capital Berlin. From the west, American, British, and Canadian forces were penetrating German territory after the successful landing in Normandy a year earlier and the massive losses of the German army in France. German cities were subjected to continuous aerial bombardment. Entire neighborhoods were turned to ashes. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed or lost their homes. Daily life became a constant attempt to survive, searching for shelter during air raids, queues for little food, conflicting news about the front. The slogan of "final victory," which the regime kept repeating, lost its meaning in the face of harsh reality. In these conditions, Hitler withdrew more and more into an enclosed underground world, the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. There he surrounded himself with a small circle of loyal aides and continued issuing orders that no longer matched what was actually happening on the ground. Maps on the walls showed armies that no longer existed, imaginary defensive lines and plans for impossible counterattacks. Whenever he received bad news, he erupted in rage and then returned to blaming others. Above ground, Berlin was turning into a final battlefield. Units of the army, remnants of party militias, and young boys from the Hitler Youth tried to stop the advance of the Red Army, but the outcome was already decided. Buildings were collapsing, streets were filled with rubble, and fear dominated the remaining population. Many stories spoke of families committing suicide, preferring death rather than witnessing defeat or falling into the hands of forces that retaliated brutally for what the regime had done on their territory. In the final days, Hitler received news of Mussolini's death in Italy and how his body had been displayed and hung in the street. These images left a deep impact on him. He who had built his life on the image of the untouchable leader was not ready to end as a defeated man whose body would be humiliated in front of cameras. Therefore, he made his final decision. He would not allow his enemies to capture him alive. At the end of April 1945, the sound of artillery around Berlin intensified, and Soviet forces approached an unimaginable distance from the center of the city. In the bunker, Hitler quickly conducted a civil marriage with Eva Braun, the woman who had accompanied him for a long time away from the public eye. Less than 24 hours later, he entered a room holding a pistol, and she held a cyanide capsule. When the aides left shortly afterward, they found that he had ended his life with a gunshot, and she had ended hers with poison. Their bodies were quickly burned in the garden of the Chancellery, in an attempt to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. With the fall of Berlin and the surrender of German forces days later, the era of the Third Reich officially ended. But the story did not end with Hitler's suicide. After the war, details of the concentration and extermination camps began to emerge to the world, and the major trials in Nuremberg began against senior leaders of the regime. These trials were not only revenge, but an attempt to establish a new standard, that there are crimes called crimes against humanity that cannot be justified by any law or any military orders. Inside Germany itself, people had to face a disturbing question. What did we know? What did we ignore? How did we reach this point? Some held on for years to the idea that the regime had revitalized the country economically before it went astray, while others later admitted that silence had been an indirect form of participation. The process of denazification was an attempt to cleanse state institutions of Nazis, but it was neither complete nor easy. Today, when we look at modern Germany, we see a country very different from the image of the Third Reich. Nazism and its symbols are legally banned. Denying genocide is a crime. Students learn in schools the details of what happened during Hitler's era, not to humiliate themselves, but so that something similar does not happen again. Museums and memorials, from small stones bearing victims' names to the sites of former camps, are a constant reminder that material and cultural progress does not prevent a society from falling into the abyss if fear and anger are left without restraint. But the greatest lesson of this story does not concern Germany alone. What Hitler did was not magic. He exploited conditions that can recur in other countries: military defeat, a crushing economic crisis, a sense of collective humiliation, fear of the future, loss of trust in the political class. In such conditions, a voice always appears telling people, "You are wonderful, you are victims, you have never done anything wrong. The problem is others, minorities, strangers, the press, other parties." The solution is simple. Give me power and I will rid you of them all. This kind of rhetoric does not die. It may change its form and language, but its essence is the same, simplifying the world into us and them, turning politics into an existential battle, and then presenting one man as the answer to all questions. The story of Hitler shows what can happen when an entire society almost chooses to believe this narrative to its very end, only to discover that the cost was far greater than it ever imagined. On the other hand, this story reminds us of the importance of things that sometimes seem boring: free press, independent judiciary, separation of powers, multiple political parties, civil society, and the uncomfortable questions raised by opponents. These elements are not luxury. They are the walls that prevent anyone from reaching absolute power, no matter how popular or charismatic they may be. For this very reason, talking about Hitler and the Third Reich remains a sensitive but necessary subject. The goal is not to be prisoners of the past, but to understand the mechanisms that transformed a scientifically and culturally advanced country into the center of a project of extermination and world war. When we understand these mechanisms, we can see their early signs elsewhere. When an entire group of people is demonized, when problems are reduced to the betrayal of a certain group, when the law is portrayed as an obstacle to the strong leader,